Right, let's get into it. I set up this box to do video editing, which everyone seems to be doing, but this was a situation where I already had all the parts, so I was just using what I had. Spare parts workstation as it is. So I threw it together with a spinning disk and a slow one at that, and it was nearly unusable in my mind. It's a 5-year-old PC, but it's pretty decent. It's got an 870K Intel CPU, which is a quad core. Yeah, it's a quad core. It's about a third the speed of today's $350 CPUs. It's got 16 gig of RAM, which is not bad. But the first upgrade I decided to do, especially with dealing with big video files and nonlinear editing, was to add an SSD. And I decided that rather than reinstall and mess with that, even though it was a fairly recent install, I'd just copy it over. But the spinning disk was 1.8 terabytes, and the SSD was 1 terabyte. If it had been like going from a 2 terabyte to a 2 terabyte, or a 500 gig to a 2 terabyte, which actually this is a 500 gig right here, but I wasn't using that one anyway. Going from a smaller disk to a bigger disk, you can just DD that thing over and then grow the file system. But I had to do kind of the reverse, shrink, and rather than literally shrinking, using E2 resize FS offline, which I could have done, and I've done before, it works. I decided to just set up the new file system and copy the data over, the raw data over, make it bootable. So there are a few ways you can skin this cat, as they say. What I'm going to try to do here is to replace the disk in my desktop, which is a spinning disk similar to this Seagate Mobile HDD 2 terabyte. It's probably even a 5400 RPM disk. I had these laying around for my storage server, and I just wanted to set up my desktop to do some video editing. What else are you going to do today? I'm going to replace it with this shiny new Samsung 1 terabyte Evo 860. You know, I'm pretty particular on the disks, and the Intels and the Samsungs have never let me down, so that's what I'm going to go with, is this Samsung. It was about under 150 for 1 terabyte, which is nice. Alright, so I'm going to shut down here. What the basic procedure is going to be here is add the SSD, boot from a USB, and I'm using the server disk, the Ubuntu 1804 server USB image, because I run servers and that's what I've got around. And then copy the data over to the Samsung, make it bootable, and then remove the old disk and boot back up into it. So let's get started. I have it open for surgery. That's the old disk. Connect this to power. Connect this to signal, the SATA signal. So we've got the SSD hooked up. I'm going to power this back on. I already have the USB disk in there. And when it comes up, I'm just going to hit F8, which on this machine allows me to select the boot disk. And I want to boot from that SanDisk Cruiser, which is my USB disk. Again, this is the Ubuntu 1804 server disk image. So we're going to boot into it. You can use of course, the desktop one. It'd be probably a little bit different. You'd probably, just off the top of my head, boot into a GUI, open up a terminal, and then be able to do this. I don't remember. So we just need to wait till we get into the installer. And I'm just going to pick some defaults, language English, keyboard done, and then install Ubuntu, the networking done, proxy address done, mirror address done, and then here at the select the disk, I'm going to do Alt F2 and go to a terminal. And then I need to sudo su to get root privileges. Now I'm able to look at those disks, and I use fdisk just out of force of habit. Probably print out a bunch of things. All these loops are nothing we're concerned about. SDA, and it says 931 gigabyte. That's about a terabyte. That's going to be our SSD. SDB shows 1.8 terabytes. That's the spinning disk that I'm currently using. It's twice the size. If it was smaller or the same size, I could just DD this over and basically be done with it. But it's bigger, so I'm going to have to basically copy the file system over manually. And SDC here is the SanDisk USB disk. So, you know, part of the boot system, the whole boot process, is to get the initial boot block and this boot partition in place. So I think I'm just going to copy over, so IF, DD to copy the raw disk, IF, and want to copy from dev SDB, which is my 2 terabyte, and out to dev SDA, which is my SSD. And really I only want that first segment, but BS equals 32K. That speeds up the performance of the copy. Rather than copying every single byte, it copies in chunks of 32K. And then status equals progress. That'll just show me how far it's getting along. It's a spinning disk, so it's probably 140 megabytes a second, 139. Yeah, we've copied a gigabyte. That's plenty. Don't need all that. I just hit Control-C to terminate it, and it took a while to finish flushing that data out. So now I'm going to use gdisk to edit dev SDA. I'm not even going to read all this. Disk is smaller than the header. Yeah, that's because I copied from a big disk to a small disk. It's going to correct that as I go into it. So printing out that that partition table, I'm going to delete 3 and delete 3, delete 2, delete partition 2, delete partition 3. Now I should have only that boot partition in there. Now, if I create a new partition number 2, first sector, this may still have the old data in it, but I'm going to do plus 900 gig. Because I want a little bit left over at the end to put a decent sized swap partition in. And 8300, that seems good. And let's see, did that make that? That did make that 900 gigs. Now 3, and I'm just going to accept the defaults, but I want probably 8200. 8200, does that tell me 8200 Linux swap? So 8200 is the type. 8200, come on. And then print it out. Let's see, we've got the boot sector, we've got the Linux file system, we've got the swap. So we want to write it. Partition 3 is too big for the disk. Oh, that showed up as 900 gig. It does still think that disk is huge. Alright, I'm going to delete 3 then, and I'm going to write it. Override existing data, that's fine, it's an empty SSD. Alright, now just to make sure the kernel understands the partition table, I'm going to reboot. SanDisk cruiser fit. And it should be a similar sort of boot, where it comes up, asks for the installer information, and then when I get to the select disk, it's going to, I'm going to switch over to terminal. Okay, language English, enter. Keyboard, enter. Install Ubuntu, enter. It's picking up my DHCP address, enter. Proxy address, enter. Mirror, enter. And here I'm going to Alt F2, sudo su, and then fdisk -l. So SDB is my spinning disk. SDA is my SSD because it's 931 gig, 1.8 gig terabytes. So I'm going to set up my swap partition before I forget. Gdisk dev SDA and 3 defaults. 8200 is what I want. And print. So 31 gig swap, 900 gig file system, and then the boot sector. I'm going to write that out. And so override existing, that's what I want. So quickly I can make the swap partition dev SDA3, and now I'm using ext, the default file system, the ext4 on the Linux box, on the Ubuntu box. So I'm going to create a file system on that SDA2 so I can copy data from the existing file system. So I can make it mkfs.ext4 dev SDA2. It contains, I think it found some information out from previous run here, so I'm going to proceed anyway. And it's writing all the superblocks. Now, typically what I do is I go into mount, I make a source, and I make a destination directory. I mount the spinning disk, dev SD, what was that? B2, it's up here, SDB2, /MT/S for my source. I mount dev SDA2 to mount D for destination, and I'm going to come over to mount S, cp-av dot to dot to dot /D. Add the slash, I don't know, it's just a habit. Make sure it's a directory. If I was copying a file and I wanted to make sure it was going to a directory, I'd do this. And if it wasn't a directory, it would blow up. But in this case, it's going to copy all those files. And it's got 230 gig to copy. So it's going to take a while. If I do Alt F3, I get another terminal. And here I can do df mount S, mount D. And we've copied over 629 meg out of 289 gig from the source partition, source file system. And so it's going to take a while. Alright, we'll check back in a bit. Alright, so the copy is finished. Now, figure out where I was at here. Copy it to D. Alright, so now we need to make D bootable. And there's the init-rd, which is the initial RAM disk. There's the boot sectors. And there's the FS tab, the file system tab. So, what we're going to want to do, first I'd just like to unmount the S, so that I'm not accidentally manipulating that. And then switch over into D. The tools that do those, setting up the init-rd and those sort of things. they require access to a few things: the proc file system, the dev file system. So I always just mount and -o bind. A bind mount is basically remounting an existing file system into a new location. It's almost like a symbolic link, but it happens at a lower level. It's closer to like a hard link, but you can do it across file systems, etc. So it's different than a hard link, but that's what I always do to set it up. So I bind mount proc to, and I'm in mount D, so I can just say proc, and I do the same for dev to dev, and dev PTS to dev PTS, and then I need sys. Then I root into mount D, and run bin bash in there. So if I go to Etsy now and modify the file system, FS tab, now what I want are the new block IDs for the root file system and for swap. So for that I can just, the VI editor, I'm just going to do bang bang blkid, and that'll, inside this file, put the various block IDs it finds. And we're interested in SDA and SDB. Sorry, SDA2 and SDA3. Yep. So SDA2, you notice over here it says ext4, so that's going to be a root file system. Just going to put it over here and remove those quotes. That was actually the way I wanted it. Okay, so, no it wasn't. Alright, so I have the root file system. Now, do the same thing for swap. Save it off. Alright, the FS tab is updated. Now we need to do the boot sector. So we can do grub-install dev SDA. That's our SSD. So that's going to put the boot information on dev SDA. And then we also want to find out what kernels we've got. Linux image, so we're looking for Linux image. If we can boot, we should see something similar to that. So I'm going to dpkg-reconfigure Linux image 4.15.0-45- and that'll remake the initrd. Take us just a moment. Alright, so now we have the initrd made, we have the boot sector done, we have the FS tab fixed. So what we need to do is exit out of Arch root, and then get out of that mount point and unmount all the file systems. Dev pts dev proc sys and id. Now I'm an old school guy. I will sync it as well 3 times. There's ancient Unix lore about sync 3 times, but sync just makes sure your changes are written out to disk. I do it. You probably don't need to, especially with unmounting it. You're probably fine. So now you should be able to reboot. Alright, it sees all of our disks. I'm going to disconnect, just unplug. So this is the SATA cable. I won't be accidentally accessing that. And then I'm going to pick the Samsung SSD. Let's see if it boots. Let's see if I did this right. There we go. If it ends up waiting too long, you probably forgot to do one of the init-rd or usually it's the init-rd or the fs tab, but in this case we seem to be booted into Linux, and we still have that SSD mounted, but there we go. So that's how you set up copy a Linux setup from one disk to another the hard way. Thanks for watching.